Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer, and this is part 2 of a presentation called Mistakes, Half-Truths, and Lies, Why Records Are Wrong. In our first program, we explored a series of inaccuracies, errors, and omissions, most of which were made simply because of gaps in knowledge. As we look at today's sequence of case studies, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated because it's more than just simple mistakes that we find in records. We're going to be looking at misremembered lore, obfuscation, which is another way of saying there's a smoke screen here out to deceive. We're going to look at half-truths, then progress to lies, and end with the totally outrageous, the stuff of which fiction is made. Misremembered lore. Lore to me means stories that we've heard, stories that we have grown up with, but the more frequently that a family story is repeated doesn't necessarily make it right. Let me give you an example. As a child, more than once a year, beginning on Memorial Day, my grandfather and I would go and pay tribute to the family stone in St. Patrick's Cemetery in Fall River. And we're going to look at the first 2 names on the stone. We have Ellen D. Flynn, supposedly born in 1865, and Annie E. Cassidy, born in 1867. Annie was my grandmother's mother, and you can see my grandmother's name a little bit farther down on the stone, Ann P. Dwyer, who died in 1964. The story that I grew up with is these 2 young lasses, my great-grandmother Annie on the left and her sister Ellen on the right, that they were teenage girls that came over from Ireland for all the reasons that we associate with Irish immigration. They were seeking a better life, and Annie met her future husband here, and he died, sadly, 6 years into their marriage after he had been killed in an industrial accident. And as I looked for information in Ireland to determine their true age, if they were teenagers in the early 1880s, then the birth dates that are listed on their gravestone seem to make sense. The other piece of corroborating evidence is if they were here by 1882 or 1883, they were actually confirmed here in the Cathedral of Providence, Rhode Island. So a lot of people growing up in the Catholic tradition associate confirmation with being somewhere in your teens. As I began to peel back the layers of this story, I was way off because the information that had been conveyed to me simply was not accurate. Here is another image of my great-grandmother, a tintype, taken with her husband, Patrick Cassidy, right around the time of their marriage in 1885. And I know that she was not the same height as he. By all accounts, he was a tall man, at least 6 feet tall. So she was likely standing on a box to be the same height as her husband. As I worked back in Irish records, I found that there was an enormous discrepancy in age. So here I was actually able to find digitized copies of the parish records from County Mayo, Ireland. Aunt Ellen's birth date on her gravestone is 14 years off, and my great-grandmother's birth date on her gravestone is 11 years off. So is there an intent to deceive here? I really don't think so, but a common element that I've often seen, particularly among Irish female immigrants of the 19th century, is the transformative magical power of an ocean voyage where they would manage to lose 5, 7, 10 years on the voyage over here. And the other thing that we have to remember about people born in the 19th century into the 20th century, no one was asking them, what's your date of birth, what's your social security number? So it could be that people didn't have an entirely accurate view of their ages. The lesson to be learned here is that we have to cast a wider net when we're looking to locate the birth date of an ancestor who came to the United States from overseas. And here are the two women late in life with their dog Buster. And one of the funny things that I think about in this picture, they had one name for dogs. And Buster, there were probably 7 or 8 Busters over the years, and that was a very common Victorian thing to name, to have one pet name, and then just to keep it. Now, one of the funny things associated with my grandmother is that we have Find a Grave, which is a very wonderful source of information, and people are free to upload information. So you already saw that my grandmother had her name engraved on the stone with her dates of birth, 1892 to 1964. But it came to me when I was looking that this is not my grandmother. So who is this, and who is this woman that put up the photograph? And what I found out was this. I had emailed a cousin of mine many years ago this picture, which is of Michael F. Dwyer and his grandmother. The Michael F. Dwyer, whom you see here in his sailor suit, was my grandfather's cousin born in 1917, not me, and this is his grandmother, who is also named Anne, but a mistake at Find a Grave, and even though I've asked for the picture to be taken down, it's still up there. Now let's talk about obfuscation. This is where there is a deliberate misrepresentation of facts or slanting information that evades the truth. And one of the things that took me a long time to unpuzzle, here is a photograph of my maternal grandmother's mother. Her name, married name, was Marion Rhodes. Very few photographs exist for her. She died in 1914 when she was 27. And as I sought to learn more information about her, my grandmother told me that her maiden name was Delano, just like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And there was, once again, some family lore that somehow that she was connected to FDR's mother's family. And although FDR's mother was born in New York, her family did indeed have roots in Massachusetts. Sadly, as I mentioned, my great-grandmother died at the age of 27, and this left her 5 children, virtual orphans. My grandmother, Lois, is the young girl slightly to the right of center with the big bow in her hair. And the lady that you see behind her looking very severe in a black dress is her grandmother, who was named Mary. So I sought to find a Mary Delano. Well, that wasn't true at all, because Mary, my grandmother's grandmother, did indeed marry a man named Irving Delano. And here they are around 1867, she in a tintype and he in a carte de visite photograph. And Irving was a Civil War veteran who came back from the war a very damaged individual. Today we would describe what happened to him as PTSD syndrome. after 8 years of a brutal marriage, she divorced him and married, and this was a very unusual thing for this time period. She married a whaler from the Azores. So his name was Mariano Silvia. So my grandmother's mother was not Marion Delano, she was Marion Silvia. And here is an annotated copy of Marion Silvia's death record. And unfortunately for me, this is an ongoing search, because when you look at name of father, name of mother, it was written by the informant on the death certificate, cannot be ascertained. Now we come to the question, why would my grandmother and her brothers have obfuscated the maiden name of their mother? And the simple reason is prejudice. And there was a great deal of prejudice in the 1920s, particularly against people coming from Southern Europe. And the Silvias were a Portuguese surname, and there were many Silvias who came from the Cape Verde Islands that were dark-skinned. And I think because of the prejudice of the time, my grandmother chose a name for her mother that was much more to her liking than the reality of Silvia. And though I loved my grandmother dearly, she was someone who kind of played hard and fast with the truth, because when she married her second husband, who was younger than she deducted quite a few years from her age. So she was 34 when she married her second husband, and as you can see here, she gave her age as 27. The other thing that she did on this wedding certificate is that she also gave her stepmother's name as parents and not her own mother. So when we find errors like this, we have to determine, was this a deliberate error or a simple mistake? These were deliberate errors, and that certainly beckons us to try to determine why. Another example, my grandmother Dwyer's brother, John Cassidy. He was a well-educated man who died when he was, about 46 years old. He died of tuberculosis. And this is not a terribly good copy, but this was the best that I could obtain 40 years ago from my hometown newspaper, the Fall River Herald News, which for the 1930s, it still has not been digitized, so this is a negative copy. The point of sharing this with you is this obituary says that John P. Cassidy died at the home of his sister, who was my grandmother. In fact, he did not. He had not resided with the family for some time. He was in a tuberculosis hospital, but there was a stigma among some people about a family member dying in a state hospital. So they rewrote the obituary to reflect the better version of things, that he died at home. And part of the story of my uncle is that there were many scurrilous stories told about the showgirl that he married. It took me many years to find out what her actual name was, and I later found out that she was no showgirl. Her name was Edie Moran, and I found that she actually remarried and led a very happy life, but that divorce circa 1920 is something that I just don't feel that I need to research any further, because there were no children of that marriage. Now let's look at another example here of an obfuscating obituary. This came from the Newport, Rhode Island Daily News in August of 1945. And it says here, Timothy Dwyer, who has made a home with his brother, Patrick Dwyer, of 14 Cranston Avenue since his retirement, etc., died at his brother's home after a long illness. Now, my dad lived 12 miles away from his grandparents. Through 1945, before he went off to boarding school, he was there every Sunday. And I said to him, Dad, was there an uncle who lived upstairs? What's the story here? This man had no death certificate in Rhode Island. So I went to the cemetery. There was no name on the stone, but I found that this Uncle Tim, his body had been transferred from Bridgewater, Massachusetts. So what was up here? Well, Uncle Tim had lived for more than 25 or 30 years at the Bridgewater, Massachusetts State Mental Hospital. In the 1940 census, he's listed here with the arrow pointing to him as a patient. This was quite a stigma for the family to admit that you had a relative that had been institutionalized for insanity for a long time. And I don't understand why this particular record for Timothy Dwyer is so wildly inaccurate by age, because in 1940 he would have been at least 62 years old. Here you can see that he is only 45 years old. And yet another instance of Irish-American obfuscation was the story behind James Mahoney, another relative who died in 1910. His family circulated the story that he was on his way to a tubercular hospital when he died en route. And again, tracing back the story, I found that he had abandoned his family many years before and had been living in a state-funded home for many years. So sometimes many families seek to rewrite the last chapter of someone's life to avoid scandal. And this is the record, of course, that shows him in this as a resident of this Cambridge, Massachusetts city home. Now let's talk about half-truths, because sometimes we say there's a kernel of truth in the story, but sometimes this can be just as confusing because you don't know what half of the truth is correct. So this is a mystery that I have been chasing down for years. In the upper left-hand corner, we have a photograph taken circa 1878 of a distant ancestor named Nathaniel B. Payne. He was born in 1791. At right is an inset from a hand-painted family register that says that Nathaniel Briggs Payne was the son of Edward and Margaret Payne, and it gives a very specific date of birth in 1791. Here's the problem. Edward Payne was a Revolutionary War veteran. His widow, in 1838, his widow Margaret, made a declaration to obtain the pension which her husband qualified for. So here is Nathaniel, her only son, whom it says that he's 48 years old, but he says, Edward Payne was my father. My father died in the year 1785. I have always understood, and since my mother has remained a widow and unmarried. You can see the problem if you're following the chronology here, because This means that Nathaniel was born 6 years after his father died. And this man supposedly had a reputation for telling the truth, and if you look carefully at his sworn statement here, he said this is his understanding, this is what he had been told. And as far as the mystery of his paternity, that's something that I am still researching. I have other supporting evidence to show that his putative father had indeed died before he was born. And I think his father is hidden in plain sight, because when his mother was a widow, a long period of widowhood, the man next door was named Nathaniel Briggs, about the same age and unmarried. How can I ever prove something like this? Perhaps through DNA evidence one day. Escalating the scale here into people that really take liberties with the truth is a man named Edward Chiat of Burlington. Edward Chiat was a Civil War veteran who in 1896 attempted to claim a Civil War pension based on the fact that he had contracted rheumatism in the service of the United States. He had been thrown from a horse, etc., etc. His pension was turned down because, in fact, the documentation shows that this man was indeed in the Civil War, but he had been hospitalized for gonorrhea, as you can see here. So this wasn't an acceptable consequence of being in the war. And just because someone applies for a Civil War pension doesn't necessarily mean that they are telling the entire truth on their application. And there are times that people simply, this has been the subject of a previous show. We have a man who lived in Pittsford for many years. His name is Frank Ujier. And on his death certificate, which his wife supplied the information, it stated that he was born in North Adams, Massachusetts in 1886. So think about this. When someone is filling out a death certificate, it really does depend on who is supplying the information, whether it's accurate or not. And what we found with this man named Frank Ujier is that in one census that you can see above, Frank Ujier, 43 years old, born in Massachusetts, but in the previous census of 1920, you can see that he was born in Canada. So what was correct? And again, for his World War I registration, it stated that he was natural born in North Adams, Massachusetts, but on his marriage record, born in Canada. And I think what happened in this instance, and we're distant enough that this is not a family scandal, yes, this man did live during his childhood in North Adams, Massachusetts, but since he did not become a naturalized citizen, it was simply easier for him to say, oh yes, I was born in North Adams, Massachusetts, and no one bothered to do the checking. And the incontrovertible evidence here is this is the baptismal record of the man known as Frank Ujier, was actually Ulrich Jouer. An instance of how names get garbled and corrupted is part of American assimilation. In the remaining segment of the program, let's look at very, very bold lies. In the upper left-hand corner, we have a lovely daguerreotype image of my 6th great-grandmother, Lovice Payne, Lovice Hall Payne, and then her mother, which is below. And I found in a genealogy of the Hall family, which was once published in a Portland, Maine newspaper, we have her father, Silas Hall, gives his birthplace in Poland, Maine. He married in 1817 Bethia Finney. And it says here that Bethia Finney died April 13th, 1852 in New York City, and that Silas now resides in Portland, Maine. Well, Bethia didn't die in 1852. She lived on until 1884. Silas was not a single man in 1871. So as this story became a whole lot more complicated, Silas served in the War of 1812, and his widow qualified as she received the widow's pension. So it was a complete shock to me to find that in 1872, as you can see from the record that appears below, Reverend Silas Hall married a woman named Hannah Barton. This was not only a bigamous marriage, this was what I would call a trigamous marriage, because Silas had also married someone else in the years in between. And he had another wife whom he abandoned named Lucy. And I have their marriage record here, where Silas Hall, D.D., Doctor of Divinity, he made up his own degree, married in Wilmington, Massachusetts in 1858. So here was a man who was a liar and a bigamist and presented himself with fraudulent qualifications. And it took me years to kind of figure this out, because he made simple substitutions to kind of throw off the trail for how he had committed a bigamous marriage. So in one census that you can see above, instead of saying that his name was Silas Hall, he said his name was Cyrus Hall, giving his occupation as a clergyman. And in the next census, you can see that, and again, in creating a little bit of a smokescreen from his name, he said his name was Cyrus Fall, not Cyrus Hall. And here is one last example of ongoing research. This is a widely circulated image of a man in a Civil War uniform. Descendants believed that this was one George Smith, who married in Waterbury, Vermont in 1888. This George Smith was born in Germany, as you can see here on his marriage certificate. He attempted to get a Civil War pension in the early 1890s. And to cut to the quick about the level of deception here, he was not even in the United States when the Civil War took place. His real name was actually George Och, O-C-H. His past before this marriage certificate is still at large. How do we know this man who told so many lies was indeed named Och? This is what happens when descendants compare their DNA evidence. This has been a very fast presentation today. I have many more examples, but this concludes part 2 of why records are wrong.